even the soldier with the green whiskers, the one and only soldier and entire army of Oz. Yes, even the soldier with the green whiskers saluted Sir Hokus when he passed. Ozma herself felt more secure since the knight had come to live in the palace. He was well versed in adventure and always courageous and courteous withal. But while I've been telling you all this, Tik-Tok had finished his story of a three-legged giant who lived in Ev. "And where is Ev?" puffed Sir Hokus, planting himself before Tik-Tok. "Ev," began Tik-Tok in his precise fashion, "is to the northwest of here on the Other side of the Im." There was a whir and a click, and the copper man stood motionless and soundless, his round eyes fixed solemnly on the knight. "Pass. Able desert," finished the Scarecrow, jumping up and kindly winding all of Tik-Tok's keys as if nothing had happened. "Pass. Able desert," continued the copper man. "That's where the old Gnome King used to live," piped Betsy Bobbin, bouncing up and down upon the sofa. "Under the mountains of Ev, and he threw us down a tube and tried to melt you in a crucible, didn't he, Tik-Tok?" "He was a very bad person," said the copper man. "Ruggedo was a wicked king, though now he's good as pie, but none the less I must confess he has a wicked eye," burst out Scraps, who was tired of sitting still listening to giant stories. But Sir Hokus could not be got off the subject of giants. "To Ev!" thundered the knight, raising his sword. "Tomorrow I'm off to Ev to conquer this terrible monster." "Large as a mountain, you say, Tik-Tok? Well, what care I for mountains? I, Sir Hokus of Pokes, will slay him." "Hurrah for the giant killer!" giggled Scraps, turning a somersault and nearly falling in the fire. "Let's go to bed," said Dorothy uneasily. She had for the last few minutes been hearing strange rumbles. Of course it could not be giants. Still, the conversation, she concluded, had better be finished by sunlight. But it never was, for at that moment there was a deafening crash. The lights went out, the whole castle shivered, furniture fell every which way. Down clattered Sir Hokus, falling with a terrible clangor on top of the copper man. Down rolled the little girls and the Scarecrow and Scraps. Down tumbled everybody. "Cyclone!" gasped Dorothy, who had experienced several in Kansas. "Giants!" stuttered Betsy Bobbin, clutching Trot. The Wizard of Oz tried to reassure the agitated company. He told them there was no cause for alarm, and that they would soon find out what was the trouble. The soothing words of the wizard were scarcely heard. What the others said was lost in the noise that followed. Thumps, bangs, crashes, screams came from every room in the rocking palace. "We're flying! The whole castle's flying up in the air!" screamed Dorothy. Then she subsided as an emerald clock and 3 pictures came thumping down on her head. What had happened? No one could say. Dorothy, Betsy Bobbin, and Trot had fainted dead away. The Scarecrow and Sir Hokus were tangled up on the floor, clasped in each other's arms. The confusion was terrific. Only the wizard was still calm and smiling. Chapter 8. Woe! In the Emerald City. The soldier with the green whiskers finished his breakfast slowly, combed his beard, pinned on all of his medals, and solemnly issued forth from his little house at the garden gates. "Forward march!" snapped the soldier. He had to give himself orders, being the only man, general, or private in the army. And forward march he did. It was his custom to report to Ozma every morning to receive his orders for the day. When he had gone through the little patch of trees that separated his cottage from the palace, the soldier with the green whiskers gave a great leap. "Halt! Break ranks!" roared the grand army of Oz, clutching his beard in terror. "Great goloshes!" He rubbed his eyes and looked again. Yes, the gorgeous emerald-studded palace had disappeared, leaving not so much as a gold brick to tell where it had stood. Trembling in every knee, the grand army of Oz approached. A great black hole, the exact shape of the palace, yawned at his feet. He took one look down that awful cavity, then shot through the palace gardens like a green comet. Like Paul Revere, he had gone to give the alarm, and Paul Revere himself never made better time. He thumped on windows and banged on doors and dashed through the sleeping city like a whirlwind. In 5 minutes there was not a man, woman, or child who did not know of the terrible calamity. They rushed to the palace gardens in a panic. Some stared up in the air, others peered down the dark hole. Still others ran about wildly trying to discover some trace of the missing castle. "What shall we do?" they wailed dismally. For to have their lovely little queen and the wizard and all the most important people in Oz disappear at once was simply terrifying. They were a gentle and kindly folk, used to obeying orders, and now there was no one to tell them what to do. At last Unk Nunkie, an old munchkin who had taken up residence in the Emerald City, pushed through the crowd. Unk was a man of few words, but a wise old chap for all that, so they made way for him respectfully. Finger toward the south, he snapped out one word. "Glinda!" Of course. They must tell Glinda. Why had they not thought of it themselves? Glinda would know just what to do and how to do it. 3 cheers for Unk Nunkie. Glinda, you know, is the good sorceress of Oz, who knows more magic than anyone in the kingdom, but who only practices it for the people's good. Indeed, Glinda and the Wizard of Oz are the only ones permitted to practice magic, for so much harm had come of it that Ozma made a law forbidding sorcery in all of its branches. But even in a fairy country, people do not always obey the laws, and everyone felt that magic was at the bottom of this disaster. So away to fetch Glinda dashed the grand army, his green whiskers streaming behind him. Fortunately, the royal stables had not disappeared with the palace, so the gallant army sprang upon the back of the sawhorse, and without stopping to explain to the other royal beasts, bade it carry him to Glinda as fast as it could gallop. Being made of wood with gold-shod feet and magically brought to life, the sawhorse can run faster than any animal in Oz. It never tired or needed food, and when it understood that the palace and its dear little mistress had disappeared, it fairly flew, for the sawhorse loved Ozma with all its sawdust, and was devoted as only a wooden beast can be. In an hour they had reached Glinda's shining marble palace in the southern part of the Quadling country, and as soon as the lovely sorceress had heard the soldier's story, she hurried to the magic book of records. This is the most valuable book in Oz, and it is kept padlocked with many golden chains to a gold table, for in this great volume appear all the events happening in and out of the world. Now, Glinda had been so occupied trying to discover the cause of frowns that she had not referred to the book for several days, and naturally there were many pages to go over. There were hundreds of entries concerning automobile accidents in the United States and elsewhere. These Glinda passed over hurriedly till she came to 3 sentences. The first sentence did not seem important. It merely stated that the Prince of Pumperdink was journeying toward the Emerald City. The other 2 entries seemed serious. "Glegg's box of mixed magic has been discovered," said the second. "And Ruggedo has something on his mind," stated the third. Glinda pored over the book for a long time to see whether any more information would be given, but not another red sentence appeared. With a sigh, Glinda turned to the soldier with the green whiskers. "The old Gnome King must be mixed up in this," she said anxiously, "and as he was last seen in the Emerald City, I will return with you at once." So Glinda and the soldier with the green whiskers flew back to the Emerald City, drawn in Glinda's chariot by swift flying swans, and the little sawhorse trotted back by himself. When they reached the gardens, a great crowd had gathered by the Fountain of Oblivion, and a tall green grocer was speaking excitedly. "What is it?" asked Glinda, shuddering as she passed the dreadful hole where Ozma's lovely palace had once stood. Everyone started explaining at once, so that Glinda was obliged to clap her hands for silence. "Footprint! Unc Nunky stood upon his tiptoes and whispered it in Glinda's ear, and when she looked where Unc pointed, she saw a huge, shallow cave-in that crushed the flower beds for as far as she could see. "Footprint!" gasped Glinda in amazement. "Uh-huh." Unc Nunky wagged his head determinedly and then, pulling his hat down over his eyes, spoke his last word on the subject. "Giant! A giant footprint! Why, so it is!" cried Glinda. "What shall we do? What shall we do?" cried the frightened inhabitants of the Emerald City, wringing their hands. "First, find Ruggedo," ordered Glinda, suddenly remembering the mysterious entry in the Book of Records. So, away to the little cottage hurried the crowd. They searched it from cellar to garret, but of course found no trace of the wicked little gnome. As no one knew about the secret passage in Ruggedo's cellar, they never thought of searching underground. Meanwhile, Glinda sank down on one of the golden garden benches and tried to think. The comfortable camel stumbled broken-heartedly across the lawn and, dropping on its knees, begged the sorceress in a tearful voice to save Sir Hokus of Pokes. The camel and the doubtful dromedary had been discovered by the knight on his last adventure and were deeply attached to him. Soon all the palace pets came and stood in a dejected row before Glinda. Betsy's mule Hank hee-hawing dismally, and the hungry tiger threatening to eat everyone in sight if any harm came to the three little girls. "I doubt if we'll ever see them again," groaned the doubtful dromedary, leaning up against a tree. "Oh, Doughty, how can you?" wailed the camel, tears streaming down its nose. "Please do be quiet," begged Glinda, "or I'll forget all the magic I know. Let me see now. How does one catch a marauding giant who has run off with a castle?" On her fingers, Glinda counted up all the giants in the 4 countries of Oz. No! It could not be an Oz giant. There was none large enough. It must be a giant from some strange country. When the crowd returned with the news that Ruggedo had disappeared, Glinda felt more uneasy still. But hiding her anxiety, she bade the people return to their homes and continue their work and play as usual. Then, promising to return that evening with a plan to save the castle and charging the soldier with the green whiskers to keep a strict watch in the garden, Glinda stepped into her chariot and flew back to the south. All that day, in her palace in the Quadling country, Glinda bent over her encyclopedia on giants, and far into the night the lights burned from her high turret chamber as she consulted book after book of magic. Chapter 9. Mixed Magic Makes Mischief. The Book of Records had been perfectly correct in stating that Ruggedo had something on his mind. He had. To understand the mysterious disappearance of Ozma's palace, we must go back to the old ex-king of the gnomes. The whole of the night after he had found Glegg's box of mixed magic, Ruggedo had spent trying to open the box. But pry and poke as he would, it stubbornly refused to give up its secrets. "Better come to bed," advised Wag, twitching his nose nervously. "Mixed magic isn't safe, you know. It might explode." "Idiot," grumbled Ruggedo. "I don't know who Glegg is or was, but I'm going to find out what kind of magic he mixes. I'm going to open this box if it takes me a century." "All right," quavered Wag, retiring backward and holding up his paw. "All right, but remember I warned you. Don't meddle with magic. That's my motto." "I don't care a harebell what your motto is," sneered the gnome, continuing to hammer on the gold lid. When he reached his room, Wag shut the door and sank dejectedly upon the edge of the bed. "There's no manner of use trying to stop him," sighed the rabbit. "So I've got to get out of here before he gets me into trouble. I'll go tomorrow," resolved Wag, pulling his long ear nervously. With this good resolution, the little rabbit drooped off asleep. Very cautiously, he opened the door of his little rock room next morning. Ruggedo was sound asleep on the floor, his head on the magic box, and Peg Amy, with her wooden arms and legs flung out in every direction, lay sprawled in a corner. "Been shaking you again, the old Scrabble-Scratch," whispered the rabbit indignantly, just 'cause he couldn't open that box. Well, never mind, Peg, I'm leaving today, and as surely as I've ears and whiskers, you shall go too. Picking up the poor wooden doll, Wag tucked her under his arm. Was it imagination, or did the little wooden face break into a sunny smile? It seemed so to Wag, and, with a real thrill of pleasure, he tiptoed back to his room and began tossing his treasures into one of the bed-sheets. He seated Peg in his own small rocking chair, and from time to time he nodded to her reassuringly. "We'll soon be out now, my dear," he chuckled, quite as if Peg had been alive. She often did seem alive to Wag. "Then we'll see what Ozma has to say to this mixed magic," continued the bunny, wiggling his ears indignantly. And so occupied was he collecting his treasures that he did not hear Rugado's call, and next minute the angry gnome himself stood in the doorway. "What does this mean?" he cried furiously, pointing to the tied-up sheet. Then he stamped his foot so hard that Peg Amy fell over sideways in the chair, and all the ornaments in the room skipped as if alive. The rabbit whirled round in a hurry. "It means I'm leaving you for good, you wicked little monster," shrilled Wag, his whiskers trembling with agitation and his ears sticking straight out behind. "Leaving, do you hear?" Then he snatched Peg Amy in one paw and his treasures in the other and tried to brush past Ruggedo, but the gnome was too quick for him. Springing out of the room, he slammed the door and locked it. Wag could hear him rolling up rocks for further security. "Thought you'd steal a march on old Ruggedo. Thought you'd tell Ozma all his plans and get a nice little reward." "Well, think again," shouted the gnome through the keyhole. Wag had plenty of time to think, for Ruggedo never came near the rabbit's room all day. At every sound, poor Wag leaped into the air, for he felt sure each blow could only mean the opening of the dreaded magic box. To reassure himself, he held long conversations with the wooden doll, and Peg's calm cheerfulness steadied him a lot. "I might dig my way out, but it would take so long. My ear tips." "How provoking it is!" exclaimed Wag. "But perhaps he'll relent by nightfall." Slowly the day dragged on, but nothing came from the big rock room but thumps, grumbles, and bangs. "It is fortunate that you do not eat, Peg, dear," sighed the rabbit late in the afternoon, nibbling disconsolately on a stale biscuit he had found under his bureau. "Shall you care very much if I starve? I probably shall, you know. Of course no one in Oz can die, but starving forever is not comfortable either." At this the wooden doll seemed to shake her head, as much as to say, "You won't starve, Wag dear, just be patient a little longer." Not that she really said this, mind you, but Wag knew from her smile that this is what she was thinking. It was hot and stuffy in the little rock chamber, and the faint light that filtered down from the hole in the ceiling was far from cheerful. At last night came, and that was worse. Wag lit his only candle, but it was already partly burned down, and soon with a dismal sputter it went out and left the two sitting in the dark. Peg Amy stared cheerfully ahead, but the rabbit, worn out by his long day of fright and worry, fell into a heavy slumber. Meanwhile, Ruggedo had worked on the magic box, and every minute he became more impatient. All his poundings failed to make even a dent on the gold lid, and even jumping on it brought no result. The little gnome had eaten nothing since morning, and by nightfall he was stamping around the box in a perfect fury. His eyes snapped and twinkled like live coals, and his wispy white hair fairly crackled with rage. Hidden in this box were magic secrets that would doubtless enable him to capture the whole of Oz, but, clumping Kalugas, how was he to get at him? He finally gave the gold box such a vindictive kick that he almost crushed his curly toes. Then, holding on to one foot, he hopped about on the other till he fell over exhausted. For several minutes he lay perfectly still. Then, jumping up, he seized the box and flung it with all his gnome might against the rock wall. "Take that!" screamed Ruggedo furiously. There was a bright flash, then the box righted itself slowly and sailed straight back into Rugido's hands, and, more wonderful still, it was open. With his eyes almost popping from his head, the gnome sat down on the floor, the box in his lap. In the first tray were 4 golden flasks, and each one was carefully labeled. The first was marked Flying Fluid, Vanishing Cream was in the second. The third flask held Glegg's Instantaneous Expanding Extract, and in the fourth was Spike's Hair Strengthener. Rugido rubbed his hands gleefully and lifted out the top tray. In the next compartment was a tiny copper kettle, a lamp, and a package marked Triple Trick Tea. So anxious was Rugido to know what was in the last compartment that he scarcely glanced at Glegg's tea set. Quickly he peered into the bottom of the casket. There were 2 boxes. Taking up the first, Rugido read, Glegg's Question Box. Shake 3 times after each question. Greg Grampus, spluttered the gnome. This is a find. He was growing more excited every minute, and his hand shook so he could hardly read the label on the last box. Finally he made it out. Reanimating rays, guaranteed to reawaken any person who has lost the power of life through sorcery, witchcraft, or enchantment, said the label. Well, did anyone ever hear anything more magic than that? Rugido glanced from one to the other of the little gold flasks and boxes. There were so many he hardly knew which to use first. Flying Fluid and Vanishing Cream, mused the gnome. Well, they might help after he had captured Oz, but he felt it would take more powerful magic than Flying Fluid and Vanishing Cream to capture the Fairy Kingdom. Next he picked up the bottle labeled Spike's Hair Strengthener. Anything that strengthened would be helpful, so, with one eye on the last bottle, Rugido absently rubbed some of the hair strengthener on his head. He stopped rubbing in a hurry and put his finger in his mouth with a howl of pain. Then he jumped up in alarm and ran to a small mirror hanging on the wall. Every hair on his head had become an iron spike, and the result was so terrible that it frightened even the old gnome. He flung the bottle angrily on the ground. But stop! He could butt his enemies with the sharp spikes. Comforting himself with this cheerful thought, Rugido returned to the magic box. Instantaneous Expanding Extract, muttered the gnome, turning the bottle over carefully. That ought to make me larger. And if I were larger, if I were larger! He snapped his fingers and began hopping up and down. He was about to empty the bottle over his head when he suddenly reflected that it might be safer to try this powerful extract on someone else. But on whom? Rugido glanced quickly around the cave and then remembered the wooden doll. He would try a little on Peg Amy and see how it worked. Turning the key, he stepped softly into Wag's room. Without wakening the rabbit, Rugido dragged out the wooden doll. Propping her up against the wall, the gnome uncorked the bottle of expanding fluid and dropped 2 drops on Peg Amy's head. Peg was about 10 inches high, but no sooner had the expanding fluid touched her than she shot up 4 feet, and with such force that she lost her balance and came crashing down on top of Rugido, almost crushing him flat. "Get off, you great log of wood!" screamed the gnome, struggling furiously. But this Peg Amy was powerless to do, and it was only after a frightful struggle that Rugido managed to drag himself out. He started to shake Peg, but as she was now 4 times his size, he soon gave that up. "Well, anyway, it works," sighed the gnome, rubbing his nose in the middle of his back. "I wonder how it would act on a live person. I'll try a little on that silly rabbit," he concluded, tiptoeing back into Wag's room. Now, Wag's apartment was about 7 feet square, plenty large enough for a regular rabbit, but 2 drops of the expanding fluid, and stars! Wag was no longer a regular rabbit, but a 6-foot funny bunny, stretching from one end of the room to the other. He expanded without even waking up. Rugido had to squeeze past him in order to get out, and chuckling with satisfaction, the gnome hurried back to his box of magic. His mind was now made up. He would take Glegg's mixed magic under his arm, go above ground, and with the expanding fluid change himself into a giant. Then conquering Oz would be a simple matter. It was all going to be so easy and amusing that Ruggedo felt he had plenty of time to examine the rest of the bottles and boxes. He rubbed some of the vanishing cream on a sofa cushion, and it instantly disappeared. The box of reanimating rays, guaranteed to reawaken anyone from enchantment, interested the old gnome immensely. But how could he try them when there was no bewitched person about? At least none that he knew of. Then his eye fell on the question box. Why not try that? So, how shall I use the reanimating rays? Asked Ruggedo, shaking the box 3 times. Nothing happened at first. Then, by the light from his emerald lamp, the gnome saw a sentence forming on the lid. "Try them on, Peg," said the box shortly. Without thinking of consequences or wondering what the question box meant by suggesting Peg, the curious gnome opened the box of rays and held it over the huge wooden doll. For as long as it would take to count 10, Peg lay perfectly still. Then, with a creak and jerk, she sprang to her feet. "How perfectly pomiferous!" cried Peg Amy with an awkward jump. "I'm alive! Why, I'm alive all over!" She moved one arm, then the other, and turned her head stiffly from side to side. "I can walk!" cried Peg. "I can walk, I can skip, I can run!" Here Peg began running around the cave, her joints squeaking merrily at every step. At Peg's first move, Ruggedo had jumped back of a rock, his every spike standing on end. Too late he realized his mistake. This huge wooden creature clattering around the cave was positively dangerous. Why, she might easily pound him to bits. Why on earth had he meddled with the magic rays, and why under the earth should a wooden doll come to life? He waited till Peg had run to the farthest end of the cave. Then he dashed to the magic casket and scrambled the bottles, the trick tea set, and the flasks back into place, and started for the door that led to the secret passage as fast as his crooked little legs would carry him. But he was not fast enough, for Peg heard, and like a flash was after him. "Stop! Go away!" screamed Ruggedo. "Why, it's the old gnome!" cried the wooden doll in surprise. "The wicked old gnome who used to shake me all the time. Why, how small he is! I could pick him up with one hand." She made a snatch at Ruggedo. "Go away!" shrieked Ruggedo, ducking behind a rock. "Go away, there's a dear girl," he added coaxingly. "I didn't shake you much. Not too much, you know." Peg Amy put a wooden finger to her forehead and regarded him attentively. "I remember," she murmured thoughtfully. "You found a magic box, and you're going to harm Ozma and try to conquer Oz. I must get that box." Reaching around the rock, she seized Ruggedo by the arm. In a panic, he jerked away. "Help! Help!" cried the Gnome King, darting off toward the other end of the cave. "Help! Help!" In his little rock room, Wag stirred uneasily. Then, as Ruggedo's cries grew louder, he bounced erect and almost cracked his skull on the low ceiling. Hardly knowing what he was doing, he rushed at the door, only to knock himself almost senseless against the top, for of course he did not realize he had expanded into a giant rabbit. But as the cries from the other room became louder and louder, he got up and, rubbing his head in a dazed fashion, he somehow crowded himself through the door and hopped into the cave. When he saw Peg Amy chasing Ruggedo, Wag fell back against the wall. "My walks and hoop soons," stuttered the rabbit. "She is alive," and he shrunk. Wag's voice rose triumphantly. "I'm going to pound his curly toes off," he shouted. With this he joined merrily in the chase. "I'll catch him," he called. "I'll catch him, Peg, my dear, and make him pay for all the shakings he has given you. I'll pound his curly toes off. Oh, Wag!" "Don't do that!" cried the wooden doll, stopping short. "I didn't mind the shakings, and gnomes don't know any better." "Neither do rabbits," cried Wag stubbornly, bounding after Ruggedo. I'll pound his curly toes off, I tell you." The old gnome was sputtering like a firecracker. What chance had he now with two after him? Then suddenly he had an idea. Without stopping, he fumbled in the box which he still clutched under one arm and pulled out the bottle of expanding fluid. Uncorking the bottle, he poured its contents over his head. Every single drop. This is what happened. First, he shot out sideways, till Peg and Wag were almost crushed against the wall. With a hoarse scream, Wag dragged Peg Amy back into his room, which was now barely large enough to hold them. They were just in time, for Ruggedo was still spreading. Soon there was not an inch of space left to expand in. Then he shot up and grew and grew and grew and groaned and grew till there wasn't any more room to grow in. So he burst through the top of the cave with a noise like 50 boilers exploding. No wonder Dorothy thought it was a cyclone, for what was on the top of the cave but the royal palace of Oz? The next instant it was impaled fast on the spikes of Ruggedo's giant head and shooting up with him toward the clouds. And that wretched gnome never stopped growing till he was 3/4 of a mile high. If the people in the palace were frightened, Ruggedo was more frightened still. Being a giant was a new experience for him, and having a castle jammed on his head was worse still. The first thing he tried to do when he stopped growing was to lift the castle off, but his spikes were driven fast into the foundations and it fitted closer than his scalp. In a panic, Ruggedo began to run, and when a giant runs, he gets somewhere. Each step carried him a half-mile and shook the country below like an earthquake and rattled the people in the castle above like pennies in a Christmas bank. Shaking with terror and hardly knowing why, the gnome made for his old kingdom, and in an hour had reached the little country of Oogaboo, which is in the very northwestern corner of Oz, opposite his old dominions. The deadly desert is so narrow at this point that with one jump Ruggedo was across and, puffing like a volcano about to erupt, he sank down on the highest mountain in Ev. Fortunately, he had not stepped on any cities in his flight, although he had crushed several forests and about 100 fences. Oh, my head," groaned Ruggedo, rocking to and fro. He seemed to have forgotten all about conquering Oz. He was full of twinges and growing pains. Ozma's castle was giving him a thundering headache, and there he sat, a fearsome figure in the bright moonlight, moaning and groaning instead of conquering. The Book of Records had been right indeed when it stated that Ruggedo had something on his mind. Ozma's castle itself sat squarely upon that mischievous mind, and every moment it seemed to grow heavier. No wonder there had been confusion in the castle. Every time Ruggedo shook his aching head, Ozma and her guests were tossed about like leaves in a storm. Mixed magic had made mischief indeed. Chapter 10. Peg and Wag. To the rescue. For a long time after the terrific bang following Ruggedo's final expansion, Wag and Peg Amy had been too stunned to even move. Crowded together in the little rock room, they lay perfectly breathless. Things happened," quavered the rabbit at last. "That sounds rather queer, but I think I know what you mean," said Peg, sitting up cautiously. "Something has happened. Ruggedo's been blown up, I guess." "Mixed magic," groaned Wag gloomily. "I knew it would explode. Say, Peg, what makes this room so small?" "What makes this room so small?" "I don't know," sighed the doll in a puzzled voice, for neither Peg nor Wag realized how much they had grown. "But let's go above ground and see what has become of Ruggedo." One at a time, and with great difficulty, they got through the door. "Why, there are the stars!" cried Peg Amy, clasping her wooden hands rapturously. "Real stars!" The top of the cave had gone off with the old gnome king, and the two stood looking up at the lovely skies of Oz. "It doesn't seem so high as it used to," said the rabbit, looking at the walls. "Why, I believe I could jump out if I took a good run and carry you, too. Come ashort, Peg. Aren't you mixed, Wag, dear? don't you mean come along?" asked Peg, smoothing down her torn dress. "Well, now that you mention it, my head does feel queer," admitted the rabbit, twitching his nose. "Bort of sackwards." "Sort of backwards," corrected Peg gently. "Well, never mind. I know what you mean. But do let's try to find that awful box of magic. You know Ruggedo brought me to life, Wag, with something in that box." "Only good thing he ever did," said Wag, shaking his head. "But I think you were alive before," he added solemnly. "You always seemed alive to me." "I think so too," whispered Peg excitedly. "I can't remember just how or where, but, oh, Wag, I know I've been alive before. I remember dancing." Peg took a few awkward steps, and Wag looked on dubiously, too polite to criticize her efforts. He didn't even laugh when Peg Amy fell down. Peg laughed herself, however, as merrily as possible. "It's going to be such fun being alive," she said, picking herself up gaily. "Such fun, Wag dear. Why, there's Glegg's box." She pounced upon the little shining gold casket. "Ruggedo didn't take it after all. Is it shut?" asked Wag, clapping both paws to his ears. "Look out for explosions, say I. For explosions, say I." "No, but I'll soon close it," said Peg, and, shutting Glegg's box, she slipped it into the pocket of her dress. It was about half the size of this book you are reading, and as Peg's pockets were big and old-fashioned, it fitted quite nicely. "Come ashort," said Wag again, looking around uneasily, for he was anxious to get out of the gnome's cave. So Peg seated herself carefully on his back and clasped her wooden arms around his neck. Then Wag ran back a few steps, gave a great jump, and sailed up, and out of the cave. "10-penny teacups," shrieked the soldier with the green whiskers, falling over backwards. What next? For Wag, with Peg on his back, had leaped straight over his head. Picking himself up, and, with every whisker in his beard prickling straight on end, the grand army of Oz backed toward the royal stable. When he had backed half the distance, he turned and ran for his life. But he need not have been afraid. "What a funny little man," chuckled Wag. "Why, he's no bigger than we are. He's no— Oh!" Then suddenly Wag clutched his ears. "Oh!" he screamed, beginning to hop up and down. "I forgot all my treasures, my olden goop-soons. Oh, my Urple Sool walks. I've forgotten my Urple Sool walks." "You're what?" cried Peg Amy, clutching him by the fur. "Now, Wag, dear, you're all mixed up. Perhaps it's 'cause your ears are crossed." "There now, do stop wiggling your whiskers and turn out your toes." But Wag continued to wiggle his whiskers and turn in his toes and roar for his Urple Sool walks. "Stop!" screamed Peg at last, with both hands over her wooden ears. "I know what you mean, your purple wool socks." "Yes," sobbed the rabbit, slumping down on a rock and holding his head in both paws. "Well, don't you think," the wooden doll shook her head jerkily, "don't you think it's just as well? Ruggedo stole all those things, and you wouldn't want stolen soup spoons, now would you?" Wag took a long breath and regarded Peg uncertainly. Then something in her pleasant wooden face seemed to brace him up. "No," he sighed solemnly, "I suppose not. I ought to have left Rug long ago." "But then you couldn't have helped me," said Peg brightly. "Let's don't think about it any more. You've been awfully good to me, Wag." "Have I?" said Wag more cheerfully. "Well, you're a good sort, Peg. A regular princess," he finished, puffing out his chest, "and anything you say goes." "Princess?" laughed the wooden doll, pleased nevertheless. "I'm a funny princess in this old dress. Did you ever hear of a wooden princess, Wag?" "You look like a princess to me," said the rabbit stoutly. "Dresses don't matter." This speech so tickled the wooden doll that she gave Wag a good hug and began dancing again. "Being alive is such fun," she called gaily over her shoulder, "and you are so wonderful." Wag's chest expanded at least 3 inches and his whiskers trembled with emotion. Hop on my back, Peg, and I'll take you anywhere you want to go, he puffed magnificently. But the wooden doll had suddenly grown sober. Wherever is the castle? She cried anxiously. She remembered exactly where it had stood when she was an unalive doll, and now not a tower or turret of the castle was to be seen. Oh, groaned Peg Amy, Ruggedo has done something dreadful with his mixed magic. Wag rubbed his eyes and looked all around. Why, it's gone, he cried, waving his paws. What shall we do? If only we weren't so small. We've got the magic box, said Peg hopefully, and somehow I don't feel as small as I used to feel, do you? Well, I feel pretty queer myself, said the rabbit, twitching his nose. Maybe it's because I'm hungry. There's a kitchen garden over there near the royal stables, and I think if I had some carrots I'd feel better. Of course you would, cried Peg, jumping up. I forgot you had to eat. So, very cautiously, they stole into the royal cook's garden. Wag had often helped himself to carrots from this garden before, but now, sitting on his haunches, he stared around in dazed surprise. Everything's different, wailed the rabbit dismally. You're the same and I'm the same, but everything else is all mixed up. Look at this carrot. Why, it's no bigger than a blade of grass. Wag held up a carrot in disgust. Why, it will take 50 of these to give me even a taste, and the lettuce, look at it. Everything's shrunk, even the houses, cried the big funny bunny, looking around. My walks and hoopsoons, everything's hunk. Peg Amy had followed Wag's gaze, and now she jumped up in great excitement.
I see it now, cried Peg. It's us, Wag. Everything's the same, but we are different.
Some of that mixed magic has made us grow. We're bigger, and everything else is the same. I am as tall as the little girl who used to play with me, and you are even bigger, and I'm glad, because now we can help find the castle and Ruggedo and try to make everything right again. Peg clasped her wooden hands. Aren't you glad too, Wag? The rabbit shook his head. It's going to take an awful lot to fill me up, he said doubtfully. I'll have to eat about 6 times as much as I used to. Well, you're 6 times as large. Isn't that any comfort? My head doesn't feel right, insisted Wag. As soon as I talk fast, the words all come wrong. Maybe it didn't grow as fast as the rest of you, laughed the wooden doll. But don't you care, Wag. I know what you mean, and I think you're just splendid. Now hurry and finish your carrots so we can decide what to do. If mixed magic caused all this trouble, added Peg half to herself, mixed magic's got to fix it. I'm going to look at that box. Wag, nibbling industriously, had not heard Peg's last speech, or he would doubtless have taken to his heels. Sitting unconcernedly in a cabbage bed, the wooden doll took the gold box from her pocket. Fortunately, she had not snapped the magic snap, and it opened quite easily. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy, and the moon was the only light she had to see by, but it did not take Peg Amy long to realize the importance of Glegg's magic. I wonder if he rubbed this on the castle, she murmured, holding up the bottle of vanishing cream. And how would one bring it back? Let me see now. One after the other, she took out the bottles and boxes and the tiny tea set. The reanimating rays she passed over, without realizing they were responsible for bringing her to life. But the question box Peg pounced upon with eager curiosity. Oh, if it only would answer questions, fluttered Peg. Then, holding the box close to her mouth, she whispered, Where is Ruggedo? Who are you talking to? Asked Wag, looking up in alarm. Now don't you get mixed up, Peg. It's a question box, said the wooden doll, but it's not working very well. She shook it vigorously and held it up so that the light streaming down from the stable window fell directly on it. In silver letters on the lid of the box was one word, Ev. Ev. Ruggedo's in Ev, cried Peg Amy, rushing over to the rabbit. Can you take me to Ev, Wag dear? Of course, said Wag, nibbling faster and faster at his carrots. I'll take you anywhere, Peg. "Then it's going to be all right, I know it," chuckled the wooden doll, and putting all the magic appliances back into the box, she closed the lid with a snap. And this time the magic catch caught. "Is it far to Ev?" asked Peg Amy, looking thoughtfully at the place where the castle had once been. "Quite a long journey," said Wag, "but we'll go a-hopping. Ev is near Rugido's old home, and it's across the deadly desert, but we'll get there somehow. Trust me." "And when I do," spluttered Wag, thumping his hind feet determinedly, "I'll pound his curly toes off, the wicked little monster." "Did you ask the question box where the castle was?" he inquired hastily, for he saw Peg was going to tell him he must not pound Ruggedo. "Why, no." "How silly of me!" Peg felt in her pocket and brought out the gold box. She tried to open it as she had done before, but it was no use. She pulled and tugged and shook it. Then Wag tried. "There's a secret to it," puffed the rabbit at last. "Took Rug a whole night and day to discover it. Can't you remember how you opened it before, Peg?" The wooden doll shook her head sadly. "Well, never mind," said Wag comfortingly. "Once we find Ruggedo, we can make him tell. We better start right off, because if any of the people around here saw us, they might try to capture us and put us in a circus." "We are rather unusual, you know." The rabbit regarded Peg Amy complacently. "One doesn't see 6-foot rabbits and live dolls every day, even in Oz."
No,
agreed Peg Amy slowly.
I suppose not.
The moon, looking down on the strange pair, ducked behind a cloud to hide her smile, for the giant funny bunny strutting about pompously and old-fashioned wooden Peg in her torn frock were enough to make anyone smile. "You think of everything," sighed Peg, looking affectionately at Wag. "Who wouldn't for a girl like you? You're a princess, Peg, a regular princess." The rabbit said it with conviction, and again Peg happily smoothed her dress. "Hop on," chuckled Wag, "and then I'll hop off." Seating herself on his back and holding tight to one of his long ears, Peg announced herself ready. Then away through the night shot the giant bunny, away toward the western country of the Winkies, and each hop carried him 12 feet forward and sent up great spurts of dust behind. Chapter 11. The King of the Illumination. While Ruggedo was working all this mischief in the Emerald City, Pompadore and the Elegant Elephant had fallen into strange company. After the prince's disappearance, Kabumpo stared long and anxiously at the white marble stone with its mysterious inscription, "Knock before you fall in." What would happen if he knocked, as the sign directed? Something upsetting, the Elegant Elephant was sure. Else why had Pompa called for help? Kabumpo groaned, for he was a luxurious beast and hated discomfort of any sort. As for falling in, the very thought of it made him shudder in every pound. But selfish and luxurious though he was, the Elegant Elephant loved Pompa with all his heart. After all, he had run off with the prince and was responsible for his safety. If Pompa had fallen in, he must fall in too. With a resigned sigh, Kabumpo felt in his pocket to see that his treasures were safe, straightened his robe, and, taking one last long breath, rapped sharply on the marble stone with his trunk. Without a sound, the stone swung inward, and as Kabumpo was standing on it, he shot headlong into a great black opening. There was a terrific rush of air, and the slab swung back, catching as it did so the fluttering edge of the Elegant Elephant's robe of state. This halted his fall for about a second, and then with a spluttering tear the silk fringe ripped loose, and down plunged the Elegant Elephant trunk over heels. After the third somersault, Kabumpo, right side up fortunately, struck a soft inclined slide, down which he shot like a scenic railway train. "Great grump," coughed Kabumpo, holding his jeweled headpiece with his trunk. "Great!" Before he reached the second grump, his head struck the top of the passage with terrific force, and that was the last he remembered about his fall. How long he lay in an unconscious state the Elegant Elephant never knew. After what seemed several ages, he became aware of a confused murmur. Footsteps seemed to be pattering all around him, but he was still too stunned to be curious. "Nothing will make me get up," thought Kabumpo dully. "I'm going to lie here forever and ever, and ever, and ever," and just as he reached this drowsy conclusion, something red-hot fell down his neck, and a voice louder than all the rest shouted in his ear, "What are you?" "Ouch!" screamed Kabumpo, now thoroughly aroused. He opened one eye and rolled over on his side. A tall, curious creature was bending over him. Its head was on fire, and as Kabumpo blinked angrily, another red-hot shower spattered into his ear. With a trumpet of rage, Kabumpo lunged to his feet. The hot-headed person fell over backwards, and a crowd of similar creatures pattered off into the corner and regarded Kabumpo uneasily. They were as tall as Pompa, but very thin and tube-like in shape, and their heads appeared to be a mass of flickering flames. "Like giant candles," reflected the elegant elephant, his curiosity getting the better of his anger. He glanced about hurriedly. He was in a huge, white-tiled chamber, and the only lights came from the heads of its singular occupants. A little distance away, Prince Pompadore sat rubbing. "It's another faller," said one of the giant candlemen to the other. "2 fallers in one day. This is exciting. An ouch it calls itself." "I don't care what it calls itself," answered the second candleman crossly. "I call it mighty rude." "How dare you blow out our king?" shouted the hot-headed fellow, shaking his fist at the elegant elephant. "Here, some of you, light him up." "Blow out your king?" gasped Kabumpo in amazement. Sure enough, he had. There at his feet lay the king of the candles, stiff and lifeless, and with never a head to bless himself with. While the elegant elephant stared at the long candlestick figure, a fat little candleman rushed forward and lit with his own head the small black wick sticking out of the king's collar. Instantly the ruddy flame face of the king appeared, his eyes snapping dangerously. Jumping to his feet, he advanced toward Pompadore. "Is this your ouch?" spluttered the king, jerking his thumb at Kabumpo. "You must take him away at once. I never was so put out in my life. Me, the hand-dipped king of the whole Illumi nation, to be blown out by a bumpy creature without any headlight." "Where's your headlight?" he demanded fiercely, leaning over the prince and dropping hot tallow down his neck. Pompa jumped up in a hurry and backed toward Kabumpo. "Be careful how you talk to him," roared the elegant elephant, swaying backwards and forward like a big ship. "He's a prince, the Prince of Pumperdink." Kabumpo tossed his trunk threateningly. "A prince?" spluttered the king, changing his tone instantly. "Well, that's different. A prince can fall in on us any time and welcome, but an ouch! Why bring this great clumsy ouch along?" He rolled his eyes mournfully at Kabumpo. "He's not an ouch," explained Pompa, who was gradually recovering from the shock of his fall. "He is Kabumpo, an elegant elephant, and he blew you out by mistake. Didn't you, Kabumpo?" "Purely an accident. Nothing intentional, I assure you," chuckled Kabumpo. He was beginning to enjoy himself. "If there's any more trouble, I'll blow 'em all out," he reflected comfortably, "for they're nothing but great big candles." Seeing their king in friendly conversation with the strangers, the other candlemen came closer. Too close for comfort, in fact. They were always leaning over and dropping hot tallow on a body, and the heat from their flaming heads was simply suffocating. "Sing the national air for them," said the Candle King carelessly, and the candlemen, in their queer crackling voices, sang the following song, swaying rhythmically to the tune. "Flicker, flicker, candlemen, cheer our king and cheer again. Neat as wax and always bright, cheers the king of candlelight. Kindle lightly, dwindle slightly, here we burn both day and nightly, here we have good times to burn, till each one goes out in turn." "Thank you," said Pompa, mopping his head with his silk handkerchief. "Thank you very much," Kabumpo groaned plaintively. for the great elephant was nearly stifled. "How is it you are so tall and thin?" asked Pompa after an awkward pause. "How is it you are so short and lumpy and unevenly dipped?" responded King Cheer promptly. "If I were in your place," he gave Kabumpo a contemptuous glance, "I'd have myself redipped. Where are your wicks, and how can you walk about without being lighted?" "We're not fireworks," puffed Kabumpo indignantly, and then he gave a shrill scream. 10 candlemen tottered and went out, falling to the ground with a great clatter. Then Pompa leaped several feet in the air, and his scream put out 5 more. "Stop!" cried King Cheer angrily. "Stand where you are." But Kabumpo and Pompa neither stopped nor stood where they were. The elegant elephant rushed over to the prince and threw his heavy robe over his head. And just in time, for Pompa's golden locks were a mass of flames. Then the prince tore off his velvet jacket and clapped it to Kabumpo's tail, which also was blazing merrily. "Great grump," rumbled the elegant elephant furiously, when he had extinguished Pompa and Pompa had extinguished him. "I'll put you all out for this." He raised his trunk and pointed it straight at the candlemen, who cowered in the far corner. "I was only trying to light you up," wailed a little fellow, holding out his hands pleadingly. "I thought that was your wick." He pointed a trembling finger at Kabumpo's tail and another at Pompa's head. "Wick!" snorted Kabumpo in a rage, while the prince ran his hand sorrowfully through his one luxuriant pompadour, of which nothing but a short stubble remained. "Wick!" "What would we be doing with wicks?" "I don't think he meant any harm," put in Pompadore, whose kind heart was touched by the little candleman's terror. "And it wouldn't help us any." "Thought it was my wick," shrilled Kabumpo, glaring over his shoulder at his poor scorched tail. "He's a wicked little wretch. He's ruined your looks." "I know," Pompa sighed dismally. "No one will want to marry me now." "It's all coming true, Kabumpo, just as Count It Up said. Remember? If a thin prince sets out on a fat elephant to find a proper princess, how many yards of fringe will the elephant lose from his robe, and how bald will the prince be at the end of the journey? And we've scarcely begun." "Great haystacks!" whistled Kabumpo, his little eyes twinkling. "So I have lost every bit of fringe from my robe and my tail and half the back of my robe besides. This is nice, I must say." "We only tried to give you a warm welcome," said the king timidly. "Warm welcome? Well, I should think you did," sniffed Kabumpo. "How do we get out of here?" "Oh, that's very simple," said the king, cheering up. "Tommy, go for the snuffer." Before Kabumpo or Pompa realized what this would mean, a little candleman named Tommy Tallow had returned with a tall black candle person. He stepped to the side wall, quickly jerked a rope, and down over Kabumpo dropped a great brass snuffer, and over the prince another. "That ought to put the cross old things out," Pompa heard the king say just before his snuffer reached the floor. "This is terrible," fumed the poor prince, thumping on the sides of the huge brass dome. "I might as well have stayed at home and disappeared comfortably. My poor old father and my mother. I wonder where they are now." Sunk in gloomy reflection, Pompadore leaned against the side of the snuffer. And one cannot blame him for feeling dismal. The fall down the deep passage, the shock of losing his hair, and now imprisonment under a stifling brass dome were enough to extinguish the hopes of the stoutest-hearted adventurer.
"I shall never find a proper princess,"
wailed Pompa, tying and untying his handkerchief. But just then there was a creak from without, and the great dome lifted as suddenly as it had fallen, so suddenly in fact that Pompa fell flat on his back. There stood Kabumpo, winding up the long rope with his trunk and grumbling furiously all the while. "Takes more than a snuffer to keep me down," wheezed the elegant elephant, hurrying over and jerking the prince to his feet. "3 humps of my shoulders, and off she goes. What makes it so dark?" "The candlemen have all gone," sighed Pompa, brushing his hand wearily across his forehead. All except that one. In a distant corner sat Tommy Tallow, and the light from his head was the only light in the great chamber. He was reading a book with tin leaves and looked up in surprise when he saw the elegant elephant and Pompadore approaching. Then he started to sputter and ran toward a bell rope at the side of the chamber. "Stop!" shouted Kabumpo, "or I'll blow off your head!" At that the little candleman trembled so violently that his flame head almost went out. "Now suppose you show us the way out," snapped the elegant elephant, stamping one big foot until the floor trembled. "You could burn out," gasped Tommy faintly. "That's what we do. Don't say out," whispered Pumpa anxiously. "We want to go away from here," he explained earnestly. "Back on the top of the ground, you know." "Oh!" whistled Tommy Tallow, his face lighting up. "That's easy. This way, please." He almost ran to a big door at one side of the room and, tugging it open, waved them through. "Goodbye," he called, slamming the door quickly behind them. Kabumpo and the prince found themselves in a wide, dim hallway. It slanted up gradually, and there were tall candle guards stationed about 100 yards apart all of the way. "Are you going to a birthday party or a wedding?" asked the first guard as they passed him. "Wedding," sniffed Kabumpo. "Why?" "Well, hardly any of the candles go out of here unless they're needed for a birthday or a wedding," explained the guard, shifting his big feet. "You're mighty poorly made, though. What kind of candles do you call yourselves?" "Roman," chuckled Kabumpo with a wink. "We roam around," he added ponderously. "Do all the candles used above ground come from here?" asked Pompa curiously. "Certainly," replied the guard. "All candles come from Illumi, and they don't like to leave either, because as soon as they strike the upper air, they shrink down to ordinary cake and candlestick size." "Distressing, isn't it?" "I suppose it must be," smiled Pompadore. "Goodbye." The guard touched his flame hat, and Kabumpo quickened his pace. "I want air," rumbled the great elephant, panting along as fast as he could go. "I've seen and felt about all I care to see and feel of the Illumi nation." "So have I." The Prince of Pumperdink touched his scorched locks and sighed deeply. "I'm afraid Ozma will never marry me now, and Pumperdink will disappear forever." "Don't be a gooch," snapped the elegant elephant shortly. "Our adventures have only begun." They passed the rest of the guards without further conversation, and after about 2 hours came to the end of the long tiled passageway and stepped upon firm ground again. Kabumpo was terribly out of breath, for the whole way had been uphill. For a full minute he stood sniffing the fresh night air. Then, turning around, he looked for the opening through which they had come. Not a sign of the passage anywhere. "That's curious," puffed the elegant elephant, "but never mind. We don't want to go back anyway." "I should say not," gasped the prince wearily. "Where are we now, Kabumpo?" "Still in the Gillikin country, I think, but headed in the right direction." "All we have to do is to keep going south," said the elegant elephant cheerfully. "But we've had nothing to eat since morning," objected Pompadore. "That's so," agreed Kabumpo, scratching his head thoughtfully, "and not a house in sight." "But I smell something cooking," insisted the prince, sniffing hungrily. "So do I," said the elegant elephant, lifting his trunk, "and it smells like soup." "Let's follow our noses, Pompa, my boy." "Yours is the longest," laughed the prince as Kabumpo swung him upon the elephant's back. So, guided by the fragrant whiffs that came floating toward them, Kabumpo set out through the trees. Chapter 12. The Delicious Sea of Soup. "Strange that we don't see any houses," puffed Kabumpo, swinging along rapidly. "I hear water," answered Pompa, peering out over Kabumpo's head, "and there it is." Rippling silver under the rays of the moon, which shone brightly, lay a great inland sea. The trees had thinned out, and a smooth, sandy beach stretched down to the shore. A slight mist hung in the air, and all around was the delicious fragrance of vegetable soup. "Somebody's making soup," sighed the prince. "But who and where?" "Never mind, Pompa," wheezed the elegant elephant, walking down to the water's edge. "Perhaps you can catch some fish, and while you cook them, I'll go back and eat some leaves." With a jerk of his trunk, Kabumpo pulled a length of the heavy silver thread from his torn robe and handed it up to Pompa. Fastening a jeweled pin to one end, the prince cast his line far out into the waves. What is it?" asked the elegant elephant as Pompa pulled the dripping line over his trunk. "Oh, how delicious, how wonderful!" exclaimed the once fastidious Prince of Pumperdink. Kabumpo could hear him munching away with relish. "What is it?" he asked again. "A carrot. A lovely, red, delightful, tender carrot. Carrot! Who ever heard of a sea carrot?" grunted Kabumpo. "I'm afraid you're not yourself, my boy. Let me see it." Snaps and crunches as Pompa consumed his strange catch were the only answer, and in real alarm the elegant elephant moved away from the shore, and in doing so bumped against a white sign stuck in the sand. "Please don't fall in," directed the sign politely. "It spoils the soup." "Soup," sputtered Kabumpo. Then another sign caught his eye. "Soup-see, salted to taste. Help yourself." Come down here directly," cried the elegant elephant, snatching the prince from his back. "Here's the soup, a whole sea full. Now all you need is a bowl." Swallowing convulsively the last bit of carrot, Pompa stood staring out over the tossing, smoking soup sea. Every now and then a bone or a vegetable would bob out of the waves, and the poor hungry Prince of Pumperdink thought he had never seen a more lovely sight in his life. "We'll probably be awarded a china medal for this," chuckled the elegant elephant. "Won't old Pumper's eyes stick out when we tell him about it? But now for a bowl." Swinging his trunk gently, Kabumpo walked up the white beach, and had not gone more than a dozen steps before he came to a cluster of huge shells. He turned one over curiously. "Why, it's a soup bowl," whistled the elegant elephant. He rushed back with it to Pompadore, who still stood dreamily surveying the soup. "I never thought I'd be so thrilled by a common soup bowl," thought Kabumpo, staring at the prince in amusement. He stepped out on a rock and dipped up a bowl of the hot liquid. "Here, drink," commanded the elegant elephant, handing the bowl to the prince. "Drink to the proper princess and the future queen of Pumperdink." "Don't go," begged the prince between gulps. "I shall want 2, 3, several." Kabumpo laughed good-naturedly. "This is the pleasantest thing that has happened to us. Here, have another." Then both Pompa and the elegant elephant gasped, for out of the bubbling waves arose the most curious figure that they had ever seen, the most curious and the jolliest. He was made entirely of soup bones, and his head was a monster cabbage, with a soup bowl set jauntily on the side for a cap. For a cabbage head he sang very well, and this was the song to which he kept time by waving a silver ladle. "Oh! I am the king of the soup sea. Yes, I am the king of the deep. My crown is a bowl, and my scepter a ladle. I fell in the soup when I fell from the cradle, and find it exceedingly cheap. I stir it up nightly, and pepper it rightly. A liquid perfection you'll find. And here is a roll, sirs. So fill up your bowl, sirs, and think of me after you've dined." When he came to dined, the Soup King gave a playful leap and disappeared backward into the waves. Pompa rubbed his eyes and looked at Kabumpo to see whether he had been dreaming. "Oh!" cried Kabumpo, his eyes as round as little saucers. Floating gently toward them were 2 large, crisp, buttered rolls. "The most charming king I've ever met," chuckled Kabumpo, scooping up the rolls and handing them to Pompa. Pompa, staring dreamily ahead, first took a drink of soup, then a nibble of roll, too happy for speech. 4 times the elegant elephant refilled the bowl. Then, his stomach full for the first time since they had left Pumperdink, the prince stretched himself out on the sands. "Now," puffed the elegant elephant ceremoniously. "If you think you've had quite enough, I'll snatch a few bites myself." Chuckling softly, he made his way back to some young trees and dined luxuriously off their tops. When he returned to the beach, Pompa was fast asleep, and for a few moments Kabumpo was inclined to sleep himself. But then, he reflected, Ozma may require a lot of coaxing before she consents to marry Pompa, and 2 of our precious 7 days are gone. It is plainly my duty to save Pumperdink. Besides, when Pompa is married, he will be King of Oz. Then I, the elegant elephant, will be the biggest figure at court. Kabumpo threw up his trunk and trumpeted softly to the stars. Then, giving himself a big shake and a little stretch, he lifted the sleeping prince to his back and started on again. In about 2 hours he had circled the soup sea and, guiding himself by a particularly bright and twinkling star, ran swiftly and steadily toward the south. As the first streaks of dawn appeared in the sky, Kabumpo passed through a quaint little Gillikin village. He snatched a bag of rolls from a doorstep and stuck them into his pocket, but he did not stop, and so fast asleep was the little village that except for a few wide-awake roosters, no one knew how important a person had passed through. The sky grew pinker and pinker. You have no idea how pink the morning skies in Oz can be. Just as the sun got out of bed, the elegant elephant came to the wonderful Emerald City itself, shining and fairy-like as a dream under the lovely colors of sunrise. Kabumpo paused and took a deep breath. Even he was impressed, and it took a good bit to impress him. He reached back and touched Pompa with his trunk. "Wake up, my boy," whispered Kabumpo in a trembling voice. "Wake up and put on your crown, for we have come to the city of your proper princess." Pompa sat up and rubbed his eyes in amazement. Without a word, he took the crown Kabumpo handed up to him and set it on his scorched golden head. Accustomed as Pompa was to grandeur, for Pumperdink is very magnificent in its funny old-fashioned way, he could not help but gasp at Ozma's fair city. The lovely green parks, the houses studded with countless emeralds, the shining marble streets, filled the prince with wonder. "I don't believe she'll ever marry me," he stuttered, beginning to feel quite frightened at his boldness. "Nonsense," wheezed Kabumpo faintly. He was beginning to have misgivings himself. "Sit up now, look your best, and I'll carry you straight into the palace gardens." No one was awake. Even the soldier with the green whiskers lay snoring against a tree, so that Kabumpo stole unobserved into the royal gardens. "I don't see the palace," whispered Pompa anxiously. "Wouldn't it show above the trees?" "It ought to," said Kabumpo, wrinkling up his forehead. "But look, who is that?" Pompa's heart almost stopped, and even Kabumpo's gave a queer jump. On a golden bench just ahead sat the loveliest person either had seen in all of their 18th birthdays. "Ozma," gasped the elegant elephant, as soon as he had breath enough to whisper. "What luck! You must ask her at once." "Not now," begged the Prince of Pumperdink as Kabumpo unceremoniously helped him to the ground. His knees shook, his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. He had never proposed to a fairy princess before in his whole life. Then all at once he had an idea. Slipping his hand into the elegant elephant's pocket, he drew out the magic mirror. "I'll see if she's a princess," stuttered Pompa. The elephant shook his head angrily, but was afraid to speak again lest he disturb the quiet figure on the bench. "And I'll not propose unless she is the one," said Pompa, tiptoeing toward the bench. Without making a sound, he suddenly held the mirror before the startled and lovely lady. Glinda, good sorceress of Oz, flashed the mirror promptly. "Great gooseberries!" cried Glinda, springing to her feet in alarm and swinging around on Pompa. "Where did you come from?" After studying a whole day and night in her magic books, Glinda had returned to the Emerald City to try to perfect her plan for rescuing Ozma. "From Pumperdink, your highness," puffed Kabumpo, lunging forward anxiously. He, too, had seen the words in the mirror, and the fear of offending a sorceress made him quake in his skin, which was loose enough to quake in dear knows. "1,000 pardons!" cried the prince, dropping on one knee and taking off his crown. "We were seeking Princess Ozma, the fairy ruler of Oz." Glinda looked from Kabumpo to the prince and controlled a desire to laugh. The elegant elephant's torn and scorched robe hung in rags from his shoulders, and his jeweled headpiece was dangling over one ear. Pompa's clothes were equally shabby, and his almost bald head with a lock sticking up here and there gave him a singular and comical appearance. "Pumperdink," mused Glinda, tapping her foot thoughtfully. Then, like a flash, she remembered the entry in the Book of Records. "The Prince of Pumperdink is journeying toward the Emerald City." "Why did you want to see Ozma?" asked Glinda anxiously. Perhaps these two strangers could throw some light on the mysterious disappearance of the royal palace. Our country was threatened with disappearance, and He thought Ozma might help us," finished the elegant elephant breathlessly. He did not believe in telling strange sorceresses about everything. Now, if Glinda had not been so occupied with the disappearance of the palace and all the dearest people in Oz, she might have been more curious about the disappearance of Pumperdink. As it was, she just shook her head sadly. "I'm afraid Ozma cannot help you," she said, "for Ozma herself has disappeared, Ozma and everyone in the palace." "Disappeared?" trumpeted the elegant elephant, sitting down with a thud. "Great grump! The thing's getting to be a habit. What was to become of Pompa now? Would he never be king, nor he, Kabumpo, ever be known as the most elegant elephant in Oz? Had they made the long journey in vain? Where? When? Gasped Prince Pompadore. "Night before last," explained Glinda. "I've been consulting my magic books ever since, but have only been able to discover one fact." "What is that?" asked Kabumpo faintly. "That they are in Ev," said Glinda, "and that a giant carried them off. I came here early this morning to see whether I could discover anything new. Would you care to see where the castle stood?" "Did he carry the castle off too?" shuddered Pompa. Glinda nodded gloomily and led them over to the great hole in the center of the gardens. For a minute she stood watching them. Then, glancing at a golden sundial set in the center of a lovely flower bed, she murmured half to herself, "I must be off." Next instant she clapped her hands, and down swept a shining chariot drawn by white swans.
"Goodbye,"
called Glinda, springing in lightly.
"I'm off to Ev to try my magic against the giants."
"Wait here, and when I've helped Ozma, perhaps I can help you. Can't we help?" "Can't we go?" cried Pompa, running a few steps after the chariot, but Glinda, already high in the air, did not hear him, and in the wink of an eye the chariot and its lovely occupant had melted into the pink morning clouds. "Now what shall we do?" groaned the prince, letting his arms drop heavily at his sides. "Do," snorted Kabumpo. "The thing for you to do is to act like a prince instead of a gooch. There are other ways of getting to Ev than by chariot." The thought of Kabumpo and Glinda's chariot made Pompa smile in spite of himself. "There! That's better," said the elegant elephant more pleasantly. "Now, what's to hinder us from going to Ev and rescuing Princess Ozma? She couldn't help marrying you if you saved her from a giant, could she? But could I save her? That's the question," muttered the prince, looking uneasily at the yawning cavity where the castle had stood. "This giant must be a terrible fellow." "Pooh," said Kabumpo airily. "Who's afraid of giants? I'll wind my trunk around his leg and pull him to earth. Then you can dispatch the villain. We must get you a sword, though," he added softly. "All right, I'll do it," cried the prince, throwing out his chest. The very thought of killing a giant made him feel about 10 feet high. "Do you know the way to Ev, Kabumpo?" "We'll have to hurry, because unless I marry Ozma before the 7 days are up, my poor old father and mother and all of Pumperdink will disappear forever. You see, even Pompa had now got it into his head that Ozma was the proper princess mentioned in the scroll. "We'll start at once," sighed the elegant elephant a bit ruefully. "I've had no sleep and precious little to eat, but when you are King of Oz, you can reward old Kabumpo as he deserves." "Everything I have will be yours," cried the prince, giving the elephant, or as much of him as he could grasp, a sudden hug. Then each took a long drink from one of the bubbling fountains and, munching the rolls Kabumpo had picked up in the Gillikin village, the two adventurers stole out of the gardens. As they reached the gates, Kabumpo paused and his little eyes twinkled with delight. There lay the soldier with the green whiskers, snoring tremendously, and beside him was a long, sharp sword with an emerald handle. "Just what we need," chuckled Kabumpo, snatching it up in his trunk. Then out through the gates and swiftly through the still sleeping city swept the elegant elephant and the Prince of Pumperdink, off to rescue Princess Ozma, a prisoner in Ev. Chapter 13. On the Road to Ev. In their journey to Ev, Peg and Wag had a night's start of Kabumpo and Prince Pompadore, but towards morning Wag's ears began to droop with sleep. "Gotta natch a sap, Peg," Wag muttered thickly as they halted on a little hill. "Natch a sap? What's that?" asked the wooden doll anxiously. Wag made no answer, just flopped on his side and in a minute was asleep and snoring tremendously. "Oh!" whispered Peg, pulling herself gently from beneath the sleeping rabbit. "He meant snatch a nap." She laughed softly and seated herself under a small tree. The birds were beginning to waken, and their singing filled Peg Amy with delight. "How wonderful it all is," she murmured, gazing up at the little ruffly pink clouds. "How wonderful it is to be alive." "Hello, Mr. Robin," she called gaily, as a bird flew to a low bush beside her. "Are your children quite well?" The robin swung backward and forward on his swaying branch, then burst into his best morning song. "Oh!" cried Peg Amy, clasping her wooden hands. "I've heard that before." "But how could I?" she reasoned. "I'm only a wooden doll, and this is the robin." Peg rubbed her wooden forehead in perplexity, for it was all very puzzling indeed. Below their little hill stretched the lovely land of the Winkies, with its great green forests and little yellow villages. The wind sent the leaves dancing above Peg's head, and the early sunbeams made lovely patterns on the grass. "I've seen it before," gasped the wooden doll breathlessly. "The trees, the birds, the houses, and everything." Springing to her feet, she ran awkwardly from bush to tree, touching the leaves and bending over the flowers as if they were old friends. Had it not been for the squeaking of her wooden joints, Peg would almost have forgotten she was a wooden doll, for at the sight of the lovely green growing things, something warm and sunny seemed to waken in her stiff wooden breast. "I've been alive before," said Peg Amy over and over. Suddenly, through the still morning air, came a loud, shrill laugh. Peg, who had been standing with her cheek pressed closely against a small tree, swung around quickly, so quickly, in fact, that she fell over and lay in a ridiculously bent double position before the newcomers. It was Kabumpo and the Prince of Pumperdink, traveling by the same road Wag had chosen, but much more rapidly. The elegant elephant had come at sunrise to the little hill. He had been watching Peg for some time, and when he saw her dance awkwardly over to the tree, he could no longer restrain himself. "Get out your mirror," roared Kabumpo, shaking all over with mirth. "Here is your proper Princess Pompa, my boy, as royal a maiden as the country boasts. Ho, ho! Kerumph!" "Don't be ridiculous," snapped Pompa, looking down curiously at the comical figure of Peg Amy. "But she's so funny," gasped Kabumpo, the tears rolling down his big cheeks. "Who's funny?" demanded an angry voice, and Wag, who had been awakened by Kabumpo's loud roars, hopped up, his ears quivering with rage. "I'll pull your long nose for you," cried Wag, advancing threateningly. "Don't you dare make fun of Peg. What are you, anyway? Great Grump. choked Kabumpo without answering Wag's inquiry. "What kind of a rabbit is this? A clawing, chawing, scratching kind, as you'll soon find out." Wag drew himself up into a ball and prepared to launch himself at Kabumpo's head when Peg straightened up and caught him by the ear.
"Don't, Wag, please,"
she begged. He couldn't help laughing.
"I am funny. You know I am,"
she sighed a bit ruefully. "You're not funny to me," blustered Wag, still glaring at Kabumpo. "Who does he think he is?" "I," sniffed Kabumpo, spreading out his ears complacently, "I am the elegant elephant of Pumperdink. Notice my pearls, gaze upon my robe." "You don't look very elegant to me," snorted Wag. "You look more like a tramp. Says he's a l'elegant elephant from Dumperpink," he whispered scornfully to Peg. "And what's that you've got on your back?" he called with a wave of his paw at Pompa. "A dunce?" "Dunce!" screamed Kabumpo furiously. "This is the Prince of Pumperdink, you good-for-nothing lettuce-eater. What do you mean by laughing at royalty? Royalty!" "Oh, ha, ha, ha!" roared Wag, rolling over and over in the grass. "But he's so funny!" He paused to take another look at the prince. At this, Kabumpo lunged forward, his eyes snapping angrily. "Stop!" begged the prince, tugging Kabumpo by the ear. "You were rude to his friend, that, doll, so you must expect him to be rude to me. It's all your fault," he added reproachfully. "Are you a prince?" asked Peg Amy, staring up at Pompa with her round, painted eyes. "Of course he's a prince. Didn't I say so before?" "Who is that hoppy creature?" "That's Wag, such a dear fellow." Peg smiled confidently at Kabumpo, and he was suddenly ashamed of himself for laughing at her. "Well, he needn't get waggish with me," grumbled the elegant elephant in a lower voice. "Oh, don't quarrel," begged Peg. "It's such a lovely morning, and you both look so interesting." Kabumpo eyed the big wooden doll attentively. It was smart of her to think him interesting. He cleared his throat gruffly. "You're not as funny as you look," he admitted grandly, which was the nearest to an apology he had ever come. "But what are you doing here, and why are you alive?" "I don't know," explained Peg apologetically. "It just happened last night." "It did? Well, where are you going?" Wag still looked cross, and his nose was twitching violently, but Peg politely answered Kabumpo's question. "We're on our way to Ev to try to help Ozma," said the wooden doll, folding her hands quaintly. "Why, so are we!" cried Pompa, sliding down Kabumpo's trunk in a hurry. "How do you expect to help her?" grunted Kabumpo, looking at Wag and Peg contemptuously. "Don't mind him," begged Pompa, running up to Peg Amy. "Tell me everything you know about Ozma." "Is she pretty?" "Beautiful," breathed Peg, looking up at the sky. "Beautiful and lovely and good. That's why I want to help her. Then I shan't mind marrying her at all," said Pompa with a great sigh of relief. "Gooch!" roared Kabumpo angrily. "Telling everything you know. Do you mean to say you think Ozma would marry you?" gasped Wag, sitting up with a jerk. "Oh, my wocks and hoopsoons!" His ears crossed and uncrossed, and with a final gurgle of disbelief, Wag fell back on the grass. "Well, is there anything so strange in that?" asked Pompa in a hurt voice. "I've got to marry her," he added, desperately appealing to Peg Amy. And while Kabumpo stood sulkily swinging his trunk, the prince told Peg the whole story of the magic scroll.